This is the ROG Keris II Origins, the latest iteration of ROG's ergonomic lineup, and one that, at least on paper, seems to improve upon the many shortfalls found in the previous iterations of the Keris series. And based off my experience with the ROG II Ace, at first I had quite high expectations for this mouse, as I assumed the design philosophy we saw on the Harpe would carry over here to the Keris, but sadly that is not the case here, and while the Keris II Origins is an improvement over the previous versions in many ways, there are several questionable aspects to the mouse's design, which unfortunately does hamper the mouse's performance and usage, especially when compared to other ergonomic mice available on the market. So in today's episode of the mel0n Review, we're going to take a deep dive into the Keris II Origins and talk in depth about the mouse's pros and cons and how ROG could improve and refine the Keris series going forward. But before we dive in, a big thank you to ROG for sending over the Keris II Origins for review, and a big thank you to all of our channel members who make videos like this possible. If you enjoy the content and want to support my in-depth reviews and of course the Teardown project, consider becoming a channel member today, as that is the best way to directly support the channel. And as always, this review will be unbiased, meaning you'll get my honest opinions of this product and every other product I cover here on the channel, with no affiliate codes, brand bias, or paid promos. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. For testing parameters, I tested the mouse for approximately 2 weeks, daily driving the mouse for both work and gaming use on both soft and hard pad types, though the majority of my testing was done on hard pads. For skates, I briefly tested the mouse's stock skate options, but due to their PTFE nature, they weren't the best for hardpad usage, so I opted to remove them in favor of using hardpad optimized aftermarket skates for the remainder of my testing. And for firmware, I tested the Keris on version 1.00.09, the latest version available at the time of this review. For versions, the Keris II Origins is available in 2 colorways, black and moonstone white. There is also a special Kojima Productions colorway, but it seems to be exclusive to Japan. For pricing, the mouse retails for a steep 190 Canadian dollars, which is cheaper than the retail price of the ROG II Ace, but much more expensive compared to ergos offered by other brands. And today I'll be reviewing the black colorway of the Keris. For packaging, the Keris comes in a similar packaging style to what we saw in the previous iteration, which we can open by removing this cardboard frame, revealing a central box. At the top of this box, we'll find a little welcome card, and under that we'll find the mouse itself, which is wrapped in a ROG branded fabric bag, similar to the fabric bags G-Wills used to include their mice in. On its base, the mouse comes with a pre-installed set of half-size speed skates, the same ones that were installed on the previous iterations of the Keris, but it's worth mentioning that the fabric bag material can fray a little bit, and if there is any adhesive bleeding on these stock skates, the frayed material will stick to their edges, but it can't be removed easily. Also on the base, above the lower skate, we'll find the mouse's USB-A dongle, which just like the dongles we've seen included with ROG's other products is an Omni receiver, which can unify multiple ROG devices to one receiver. However, if you utilize this feature, the connected devices report rates will be capped to 1 kHz, so keep that in mind. But one great thing to see here, and just as we saw in ROG's other products, on the mouse's base there is a scannable QR code that links to the mouse's FAQ and support pages, which is a fantastic attention to detail I wish more brands would implement on their products. Under the mouse, we can now remove this large origami-like insert, which you can fold out, revealing this longer compartment, which houses the mouse's stock cable, which is the same type of stock cable we've seen included with ROG's previous mice, which is a great thing to see as their stock cables are actually quite good, but we'll talk more about it later. Also included in this insert, we have a small box in which we'll find a USB-A to C adapter, which is the same clip type adapter we've seen included with ROG's previous mice. Personally speaking, I'm very happy to see this adapter return, as instead of it relying on a rubber base as most adapters do, this one has a metal clip on its base, which you can use to physically anchor the adapter to your mousepad. This clip mechanism not only allows the adapter and the dongle to be securely anchored to your mousepad, it also ensures that the dongle is in optimal transmission position, something that a shocking amount of users and pro players ignore when setting up their peripherals. But while this clip dongle is a great feature, out of the box the clip is very very tight, too tight for many modern mousepad types. As such, I'd recommend loosening the clip's tensioning screws slightly, as this will allow the dongle to comfortably clip onto most mousepad types. Next, this box also includes 2 extra ROG branded switches, which are the same type as the ones pre-installed inside the mouse, which is an awesome accessory to see included, as if one of the stock switches wears or fails, you can replace it with these extras without having to rely on aftermarket options, and we'll talk more about these stock switches, their hot swap nature, and their performance later in this video. And lastly, this box includes a ROG branded metal switch puller, which makes swapping the mouse's switches very easy, which is another great accessory to see included here. Next, in the bottom of the box, we'll find a small black envelope, the same type as the ones included with ROG's other releases, which includes a sheet of holographic ROG themed stickers, a set of pre-cut grip tapes, which are the typical types we've seen included with ROG's mice, and a full set of PTFE skates, which are the same single layer design as the smallest surface area ones pre-installed on the mouse's base, and we'll talk more in depth about the included grips and the stock skates performance and usability later in this video. Under this black envelope, we'll also find a rather in-depth user manual, which lists the mouse's accessories, key functions, and most importantly, instructions on how to open the mouse to swap the switches. This is something I've been wanting brands to include with their products for a while now, as this makes it much easier for users to service or properly recycle the mouse, and as an added benefit, the manual is multi-language, which is something we don't see often, and is a great attention to detail from ROG here. And lastly, we have a rather large warranty information booklet, which is also multi-language and outlines the terms and conditions for the mouse's 1-year manufacturer warranty. As a preface to this segment, keep in mind that my unit was sent to me directly by ROG, so take the build quality and QC of my unit with a grain of salt. Firstly, for build quality, the Keris shell is surprisingly rigid despite the shell being made of a bio-based nylon, as both the top and base shells are solid, with no noticeable flexing to them, but there is a tiny bit of creaking to the shells if you use the mouse after opening it, but this is very minor and goes away once the shells settle, so to speak. Now, the shell's rigidity can be attributed to this central cage like structure ROG is using here, which is similar to the ones we saw inside the Keris II Ace, but a little more complex here, as several parts of this cage support the mouse's top shell. For QC, the mouse is overall solid, as the main and side buttons actuation weights are decently balanced and decently well implemented, though the side buttons are slightly heavier than the main clicks. The scroll wheel is also decently implemented, though it does use a pillar switch for its click, meaning it has that expected spongy feel to it. And the mouse's PCB soldering, while they are a little unique in their design and a little complex, the soldering quality to them is good, with no noticeable issues from my inspections. But, just like we saw in every other ROG mouse to date, again they haven't secured the sensor lens to the sensor itself, meaning that the only support the lens has is the base shell. Now, to be fair, the sensor lens wasn't anchored on the Keris II Ace I reviewed last year either, but this is something I'd like to see ROG address in their future releases, as the lens is a very important aspect to the mouse, as if this lens is loose and even by an extremely slight margin, it can actually make the mouse completely unusable, which is why every other brand anchors the sensor lens to the sensor, something ROG should absolutely be doing to mitigate any potential issues on their products. For weight, due to the addition of several components and additional RGB inside the mouse, the Keris II Origins is a much heavier mouse than its predecessors. ROG is advertising that the mouse will weigh around 65 grams on their product page, but on the product box it lists the weight as being 64 grams, and both of these advertised specs do not have any plus-minus gram ratios to them. But regardless, the industry standard of plus-minus 2 grams still applies here, and I'm going to go off the weight listed on the product box, giving this mouse a weight spec of 64 plus-minus 2 grams. Now, my unit's base weight with no skates or grips installed on it is 62.08 grams, whereas with the pre-installed smaller surface area stock skates installed, around 1.1 grams is added to the base weight, whereas the extra full-size skates when installed add around 2.54 grams to the weight, meaning in the mouse's stock configuration it'll weigh around 63.2 grams, and with the full-size skates installed, the mouse will weigh around 64.6 grams. And if you utilize the grip aids, they'll add around 0.76 grams to the mouse's base weight in their full-size configuration. So just like we saw in the ROG II Ace and the previous version of the Keris, the mouse's weights are within the mouse's advertised 64 plus-minus 2 gram spec, which is a great thing to see from ROG, and I hope they continue to advertise such accurate weight specs for their products in the future. But as I mentioned a moment ago, compared to the Keris II Ace, which weigh between 53.6 and 55.4 grams, this 63.2 to 64.6 gram range is noticeably heavier and not something I exactly expected here, even though both versions of the Keris use a lighter bio-based nylon in their shells, as mice usually get lighter per generation, not heavier. Now, the majority of this added weight is due to the mouse's massive battery as well as many RGB related features inside the mouse, which personally I don't think are necessary here, but seeing as this mouse appears to be more aimed at the consumer market, not the pro or enthusiast market, I understand why there's so much RGB inside the mouse. But regardless of the culprits for this heavier weight here, I will say I don't mind the weight too much, as this heavier weight range works quite well for an ergonomic shape and gives the mouse a good hefty feeling, similar to what we found on Vaxi's older mice, which of course will take time to get acclimated to, especially if you're coming from a lighter mouse, but the heavier weight does give the mouse a very controlled feeling even when used on hard pads or with very speed optimized skates. All that said though, coming from the ROG Keris II Ace, I admit the weight here isn't exactly what I was expecting, and hopefully in the future we'll see ROG make a Keris with the same design methodology that we saw in the ROG Keris II Ace, as with a more average weight, a slightly smaller battery, and significantly less RGB, I think the mouse would feel much better in the hand. For axis balancing, as expected for an ergonomic shaping, the Keris is centrally balanced on its 60.5mm physical midline, and on the mouse's y-axis, the mouse is again centrally balanced, but as is typical for many ergo mice, the mouse is ever so slightly left-heavy, but not in a way that will negatively impact the mouse's usage experience. Circling back to the mouse's x-axis, despite the centralized balancing here, unlike other ergo mice, the Keris doesn't have a balancing range at all, as it is very tightly balanced on its physical midline, meaning that depending on your hand size and grip style, the mouse will feel ever slightly forward or rear heavy, which can initially slightly skew the mouse's feel, but after a few days you should acclimate to this without issue. But despite this potential acclimation period, the central balancing is a nice touch here on the Keris, as it does allow the mouse to be quite universal in terms of its hand size and grip style compatibility, which we'll talk more about later. Another balancing related note I wanted to make here is that the mouse's physical midline and balancing point is positioned slightly above the mouse's rather unique sensor position, which will further add to the mouse's odd initial feeling, but we'll go over the unique sensor position and its effects later in this video. And lastly, I wanted to mention that the crux of the Keris' central balancing is the mouse's massive battery, which is positioned in the top of the central cage-like structure here, just like we saw in the Keris II Ace. As such, if the battery's position is changed or it's replaced with a lighter or heavier one, the mouse's balancing will be affected, so keep this in mind if you plan on modding the mouse's battery. For shaping, the Keris, just like all other iterations in this series, is an ergonomic mouse, which is designed for right-hand use. But one thing I'm quite happy to see here is that ROG hasn't changed the mouse's shaping at all coming from the Keris II Ace, which is a great decision in my opinion, as I quite like the Keris' shape, as it feels like a slimmed down but more aggressively tilted Vaxi Outset AX, which technically speaking is just a Vaxi E1 or a Pulsar X-Lite adjacent shaping. But regardless of its similarities to other mice, the shaping of the Keris is great, and I'm glad ROG didn't alter it, and I hope they continue to keep this same shaping on their future versions of the Keris. Now for dimensions, for length, the mouse measures 121mm long. For widths, at the shell's forward region, at the top, the mouse measures approximately 61.2mm wide, and at its base it measures approximately 60.1mm wide. At the shell's mid region, at its top, the shell measures approximately 58.3mm wide, and at its base it measures approximately 57.8mm wide, forming the thinnest part of the mouse's shell. And at the mouse's rear region, at the widest part of its rounded curvature, the shell measures approximately 67mm wide at its base. For heights, since this is an ergonomic shell, the mouse's left and right sides will differ in heights quite significantly due to the shell's ergonomic curvature, meaning at the shell's forward region, around the midpoint of the scroll wheel on the left side of the shell, it measures approximately 29.7mm tall, whereas on the right side it measures around 25.5mm tall. At the shell's mid region, on the left side the shell measures around 42mm tall, while on the right side the shell measures around 36.6mm tall. And at the shell's rear region, at its mid to low area where the ergonomic shaping isn't as pronounced, both the left and right sides share a similar 19.4mm height, which tapers downward to a small lip at the base which measures approximately 3.7mm tall. For shell profiles, looking at the mouse from the top down, we can see the expected ergonomic shaping we've seen on the previous versions of the Keris, having the expected semi-wide top region, thinner mid region, and thick widened rear region, with the expected rounded left-leaning rear flare-out you'll find on many ergonomic mice. Flipping the mouse over and looking at it from the base, we can clearly see the mouse's ergonomic shaping just flipped, but from the base we can get a much better look at the shell's shaping, and we can best see the thinner mid region that we talked about a moment ago. From this perspective, we can also see the base shell is much thinner than the top shell, meaning the mouse's side shell profiles are likely going to be very inwardly tilted, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Looking at the mouse from its sides, we can get a clear view of the mouse's top shell shaping, which just like the previous versions of the Keris, has a rather rounded curvature to it, which is less aggressively tapered toward the mouse's front, whereas the rear of the shell is more aggressively tapered, but the slant is more gradual. We can also see that the mouse's hump peaks at the mouse's physical midline, and as we just talked about, there's a significant difference between the heights of the mouse's left and right sides, as we can see here. Turning the mouse and looking at it from the front, firstly we can see the curvature of the top shell's forward region, which has a more flattened curvature than we traditionally see on many ergonomic mice. Here we can also see that the shell's ergonomic curvature is rather pronounced, though it's not as aggressive as the tilt we saw in the Vaxi E1 was, for example, but the tilt is comparable, maybe even a little more aggressive than the tilt we find on most ergo mice. From the front we can also best see the curvature of the mouse's side shells, as the mouse's left side, right from the front, is more outwardly tilted than the opposite side and has a rather pronounced rounded ridge at its forward region. From that point, the curvature flattens but becomes more inwardly tilted at the thinnest part of the side shell's profile. Past that point, the shell reverts to its outward tilt and continues until the end to mid region of the side shell, right where the rear shell flare-out starts, as then the side shell inverts, melding into the rear shell's profile. On the opposite side, the right side, left from the front, the side shell, as mentioned a moment ago, is still outwardly tilted and rounded, but less so than the left side shell, which still does have a pronounced ridge towards its front, just smaller due to the shell's curvature. The tilt and shaping of the right side, though, is similar to that of the left side, just not as curved, but it follows a similar design, as the side shell becomes slightly more inwardly tilted at the high mid region, then reverts its curvature to be similar, and continues until the end mid region of the side shell, right where the rear shell flare-out starts, and then it inverts, melding into the rear shell's profile. And lastly, from the rear, we can best see the shaping of the mouse's gradual sloping hump, which is notably a little more curved compared to the forward region, which was flatter. We can also see that the ergonomic tilt of the shell is quite pronounced here, as it is throughout the shell's mid region as well, and as mentioned earlier, the curvature of the rear region is a more gradual curvature, which we can see here, along with the aforementioned more pronounced profile. For contact areas for my 25.4 by 10.16 centimeter hands using an angled claw grip here on the Keris, starting with palm contact. The wider flared rear shaping and the sloped rear hump allows for thenar contact at its low to mid region, mid palm contact in its high region, and hypothenar contact in all regions. And as is usual, my thenar and hypothenar contacts are the primary anchoring points here, whereas the mid palm contact is more supportive. For finger contact, in its natural position, my thumb rests at the forward region of the left side shell, but if needed I can angle my thumb inward to rest it at the deepest part of the left side shell's profile if more control is needed. For my index and middle fingers, they rest towards the end region of the shell buttons, but due to the grooving in the button surface, my fingers are naturally guided to the center of the buttons. For my ring finger, it rests at the right side shell's forward region, roughly opposite the position of my thumb at its natural angle on the shell's left side. And lastly, my pinky finger rests just below my ring finger in the right side shell's upper mid region, slightly below where my thumb would rest when angled inward on the shell's opposite side. For hand size and grip style compatibility for the Keris, since this is an ergonomic shape and a rather heavy mouse, the mouse's hand size and grip style compatibility will vary slightly from other lighter ergonomic mice that are available on the market. But as a reminder, given the shaping, this mouse is right hand optimized and cannot be used with any left-handed grip styles. For hands measuring approximately 12.5 to 14.7 by 5.6.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm grips. For hands measuring approximately 14.7 13.7 to 15.2 by 6.5 to 8 centimeters. The mouse will be best suited for palm grip, but might be claw grippable with hand sizes in the higher range here. For hands measuring approximately 15.2 to 16.5 by 8 by 9.5 centimeters, the mouse is best suited for palm and claw grips. For hands measuring approximately 16.5 to 17.8 by 9.5 to 10.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm and claw grips again. For hands measuring approximately 17.8 to 19.1 by 10.5 to 11.5 centimeters, the mouse will again be best suited for palm and claw grips. For hands measuring approximately 19.1 to 20.3 by 11.5 to 12.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for claw grips. And for hands measuring approximately 20.3 to 21.6 by 12.5 to 13.5 centimeters, the mouse will again be best suited for claw grips. Now, technically speaking, larger hands could also fingertip grip the Keris II Origins, but due to the mouse's heavier weight and its size, it's not a very fingertip grippable mouse, but you can use that grip style here if you want, though the experience with this grip style will be much better with lighter ergonomic mice available from other brands. And keep in mind, as always, that this is a rough estimate, and the actual hand size and grip style compatibility will vary from person to person. So if you're considering the Keris II Origins, I'd recommend measuring the length of your hand from the tip of your fingers to just below your proximal wrist crease, and the width of your hand by measuring the width of your knuckle, excluding your thumb, and you can use these measurements to estimate if your hand size is compatible with the mouse. For coating, unlike the previous versions of the Keris, all of which notably lacked a shell coating, the Origin does have a coating applied to its shell, which is a great improvement. However, ROG has only applied the coating to the top shell and the side buttons, not the main clicks, which is a rather confusing decision, which we'll talk more about later. Now, the shell's coating appears to be similar to the one we found on the ROG II Ace, which ROG describes as being a matte coating, which instead of having a balanced feel between chalkiness and rubberiness, leans more towards the rubberized side of the spectrum, slightly less so than the ROG II's coating, but only by a slight margin. This gives the coating a similar feel to the coating we found on the Razer DeathAdder V4 Pro, just less rubberized in its feel, but despite this, the coating performs amazingly and provides strong anchoring for both wet and dry hand types, and unlike the previous iterations of the Keris, the coating performs so well I never felt the need to utilize the included grip aids on the sides of the mouse, but due to the lack of coating on the main clicks, I did have to use the grips there, and I wish ROG applied the shell's fantastic coating to the main clicks, as that would have drastically improved their feel and usage experience, and I wouldn't be so reliant on grip aids to use them. But just like all great coatings, the one here does collect oils, dust, and debris like a magnet, which is especially noticeable on the mouse's black colorway. Thankfully, this buildup never affected the coating's performance, but it does give the mouse a grimy look to it. But any debris on the shell can be easily removed with a dry microfiber cloth, and if you're particular about the aesthetics of your mouse, I'd recommend sticking to the Keris II's lighter moonlight white colorway, as buildup will be much less noticeable on the white shell. For the included grip aids, as mentioned earlier in this video, the Keris includes the same type of grips we've seen ROG include with their previous releases. These grips come in a pre-cut full-size set that include 2 click covers and 2 side covers, all of which have a semi-thin form factor and ROG theme designed across their surfaces. The left side cover also has slits cut into it so the side RGB can shine through, which is a cool little attention to detail. Disappointing though, and just like ROG's other products, the mouse doesn't include any universal side button or hump cover pieces, which is something I expect to be included with a mouse of this price point. Now, the grips themselves, as expected, have the same raised, flattened triangular texturing we've seen before, and the grips material does have a decent degree of natural stickiness to it, which gives these grips a decently sticky feel to dry hands, but when gripped with wet hands, the grips become very slippery due to lack of texturing. As such, while the included grip aids are good, much better than the grip aids included with many similarly priced mice, their performance pales in comparison to aftermarket options, and given the new coating applied to the Keris' shell, these grips do feel a little out of place in my opinion, as the coating provides ample gripability to both wet and dry hands, not just dry hands like the grips do, on most of the shell that is, but due to the uncoated nature of the main clicks, you'll still want to use these included grip aids or aftermarket ones on the main buttons due to their slippery nature. But while the included grips are better than the grips included with most big brand mice, I still think they should be improved, as grip aids in a modular form factor that include universal side button and hump cover pieces, similar to what G-Wills includes with their mice, would be a great improvement here, as the grips G-Wills includes with their products are the golden standard in my opinion, and if ROG could mimic that kind of style of grips here with their products, it'd be a great improvement. For main clicks, here we'll find a familiar button design as the mouse uses the same click design we saw in the Keris II Ace, using these elongated wedge-shaped buttons with rounded ends, which as expected given the mouse's ergonomic nature, are tilted to match the top shell's tilt. Another aspect to these buttons that's carried over from the previous Keris is the button's texturing, as both buttons have a granular texturing applied to their surface, but as I just mentioned, oddly, despite the rest of the shell being upgraded with ROG's fantastic coating, the main clicks lack any coating. But despite this, the buttons do have a rather pronounced grooving in their end to mid region, which while not being the most pronounced, is deep enough to guide your fingers towards the middle of the shell buttons, and also helps to somewhat flatten the click surface, counteracting their tilted nature slightly. However, the lack of coating makes it rather difficult to keep your fingers anchored on the buttons, despite the guidance from the grooving. This lack of coating is one of the more questionable aspects of the mouse's design, as this is something I critiqued on the Keris II Ace, and for whatever reason, ROG added the coating to everywhere else in the top shell, even the little gap between the main clicks, but not the buttons themselves. This results in the main clicks being one of the weakest aspects to the mouse, as due to their slippery nature, the usage of the main clicks is a mixed bag at least, and a massive downgrade from the experience of the main clicks in the ROG II Ace. Thankfully though, you can somewhat improve their usage by using the included click covers, but again, compared to other brands' mice, all of which have coatings applied to their entire top shell, including the main clicks, the usage experience of those mice's main clicks is much better, and you won't be reliant on grip aids to use them. Yet another questionable aspect to the design of the main clicks here is the button's thickness, as ROG made the buttons rather thin. This makes them feel rather cheap, as their thinner material is kinda pliable in some cases, and is rather noticeable with heavier actuations, specifically at the button's end region. But on the plus side, both the shell buttons are indented into the shell, allowing both the buttons to be largely immune from interference from fingers resting against the mouse's side shells, but since the indentation method here is a gapping, not a walling like we've seen on other ergo mice, if you rest your fingers against the upper region of the mouse's side shell, in some cases you might experience some interference on the main clicks, but this will be a rare case, and for most hand sizes, the gapping on the main clicks will be wide enough to prevent any interference issues. For click heights, and as expected given the ergonomic shaping, the height of the shell buttons will differ on the mouse's left and right side, as on the left click at its end region, the click measures approximately 21.1 millimeters tall, at its mid region it measures approximately 29.7 millimeters tall, and at its top region it measures approximately 36.5 millimeters tall. Whereas the right click at its end region measures around 16.7 millimeters tall, at its mid region it measures approximately 25.5 millimeters tall, and at its top region it measures approximately 30.4 millimeters tall. In terms of audio feedback, here's a quick sound test of the Keris II Origins main clicks. Inside the mouse, unlike the optical switches we saw inside the Keris II Ace and the ROG II Ace, here in the Origins, ROG has opted to use their mechanical versions, which are termed ROG Microswitch Gen 2 on the product box. Sadly, I was unable to find any manufacturing information about these switches, but if I had to guess, they're likely manufactured by Kale, Wano, or TGC, and just rebranded with ROG's branding, same as what we saw with their optical switches. These switches are a more traditional sound and feeling switch compared to their optical counterparts, but unlike the optical ones, these switches are a little lighter in terms of their actuation force, feeling around at 65 grams by my estimations, but they do have the same cycle rating as their optical counterparts, as they're rated for 100 million cycles. But as is typical, while these switches have an actuation weight of around 65 grams at their end to mid region, at their top region, the switches are a little heavier, feeling around a 75 gram actuation force from my estimations, but this is normal as every mouse's main clicks are heavier if actuated at their top region. These switches, as you might have noticed, are mounted rather uniquely, as instead of being clipped into the PCB as I've seen on ROG's optical switches, these switches are installed into this socket-looking structure. This is ROG's brand new push-pin socket Gen 2, which not only allows these switches to be hot swappable with the extra included switches, but also several other switch types, and we'll talk more in depth about this Gen 2 hot swap socket in a moment. For stabilization, despite the button's thinner feel, they are decently stabilized, feeling similar to the main clicks we saw in the Harpe 2, as both buttons have a very slight degree of play to them even when actuated, but again the thinner material does give these buttons a bit of wobble to them, especially if actuated on their edges, but since the buttons have a pronounced grooving in their surface that guides your fingers toward the center of the buttons, you're likely not going to experience any wobbling issues here. For travel ranges, this is where the main clicks get rather weird, as both the shell buttons have a medium to long degree of pre-travel and a medium degree of post-travel, the longest travel ranges I've seen on a main click in a very long time, which definitely hampers the feel of the main clicks compared to more tensioned implementations we've seen on other mice. But on the plus side, the button's rebound is quite strong, which does help to counteract the longer travel ranges somewhat and makes the button somewhat spammable. But one really nice attention to detail here is that just like we saw in the Harpe 2 Ace, the main click stabilizers are pre-lubed inside the shell, which will prevent any grinding issues with the main clicks for the lifespan of the mouse. But if you do notice any issues, you can re-lube these as needed, and if you want to learn how to do this, check out the Keris II Origin teardown video, which will be releasing very soon. And lastly, before we talk about this hot swap switch socket, currently there is no way to adjust the debounce values of the main clicks even with other switch types installed, which is very disappointing and something I hope ROG will add support for in the near future. As I just mentioned, ROG has implemented a brand new hot swap switch mount here on the Keris II Origins, which they call their push-pin Gen 2 socket system, which unlike the Gen 1 system, which only supported 3-pin switch types, this Gen 2 socket supports both 3 and 5-pin types. And the process of swapping these switches is very easy here, being roughly as simple as swapping the switches on the endgame gear OP1AK, and ROG even has a guide video showing the process, and as we saw earlier, the user manual also shows how this process is done. As all you have to do is take out 2 rubber stoppers on the mouse's base, unscrew 2 Phillips head screws, and then simply disconnect the top and base shells to access the switch sockets. Now, ROG officially states that this socket is compatible with several Omron and Kale SKUs, and you can find the full list on their website, and I'll have that linked down in the video description for you. But seeing as I don't have all those switch types on hand, I just tested all the switches that were included with the endgame gear OP1AK's switch pack, of which the Omron D2CFFKs work totally fine, the Wano white shell white dot switches worked as well, Wano blue shell pink dot switches also worked, and Wano silent switches worked as well, TTC golds worked without issue, and the rather underrated HNCHK switches also worked totally fine. Now, technically speaking, switches with speed modes such as Wano's SPDT switches or the Kale GX switches are also supported here, but their speed modes are unsupported, meaning they'll only operate as a traditional switch. So as it turns out, even though many of these switches weren't listed as being compatible, they do still function here on ROG's Gen 2 socket system, which is a great surprise. However, keep in mind that since there's no way to adjust the main click's debounce, you might experience double clicking with some switch types, so keep that in mind. But overall, ROG's Gen 2 socket system is actually quite impressive. So far, Incod and Endgame Gear, to my knowledge, have been the 2 brands who've excelled at implementing hot swap switches on their products, but with the Gen 2 system here, ROG joins them, and I'm so happy to see another brand adopt hot swap systems on their products, as it not only allows customers to tweak the mouse's feel to their liking, it also makes repairing the main clicks, the mechanical component that will have the most wear and tear on the mouse, extremely simple, which is a fantastic feature to see here, and hopefully we'll see the system return on ROG's future products. For side buttons, just like its predecessor, the Keris uses the same small chip-shaped buttons which have a flattened surface and angled edges, which are tilted slightly forward to match the curvature of the top shell. The shaping of these buttons is eerily similar to the buttons used by Razer and Pulsar on their ergo mice, but oddly ROG opted to keep the button size small, which does impact their usage slightly, but we'll talk more about this in a moment. These buttons are positioned forward of the mouse's 60.5mm physical midline, being centered on roughly the 67mm mark, which is a smart move by ROG, as the forward position ensures both the side buttons are usable with essentially every hand size and grip style, which is a nice attention to detail. And keeping in theme with similarities to the previous Keris, the side buttons share the same pronounced nature, as they're semi-pronounced in the mouse's side shell, enough to keep them usable, but I think ROG could benefit from making these buttons slightly taller and a little more pronounced on a future version of the Keris. The side buttons also share the same angled gapping between the buttons, which in my opinion is still a little too thin, as it's easy to misactuate the opposite button when clicking the side buttons on their inner edges, something ROG should address on a future iteration of the Keris. However, unlike the side buttons on both the previous Kerises and the ROG II Ace, the side buttons here do have a coating applied to them, the same type that's applied to the rest of the top shell. This is a fantastic improvement as all of ROG's aforementioned mice have had slippery side buttons, but the ones here, despite their smaller size, are quite grippable due to their flattened surface and said coating. In terms of audio feedback, here's a quick sound test of the Keris II Origin side clicks. For the side button switches, just like we saw in the Keris II Ace, inside we'll find two KL black shell green dot micro switches, which are a heavier switch type than what you commonly expect to see for a side button switch, but they work surprisingly well here despite my past experiences with them. The reason for this, I assume, is that ROG has either binned these side button switches or ordered custom versions with a lighter actuation weight, as instead of these switches having an 80-gram actuation weight as the side buttons on the previous Keris did, these switches feel more akin to a 70-gram actuation weight, which vastly improves the side button's usability and performance compared to the previous Keris and gives the mouse a fairly balanced feel in regards to its actuation weights. But while these switches are improved from the ones we've seen before, sadly I was unable to find a spec sheet for these switches as they're a rather odd SKU, so I unfortunately don't have exact cycle ratings for these switches, but given that most side button switches have a rating between 3 to 5 million, I assume these switches will share a similar rating. For stabilization, both the side buttons are quite well stabilized with only a slight degree of play to them even when actuated, but both buttons do have a slight degree of wobble to them, but this will only be noticeable when actuating the buttons on their inner or outer edges. For travel, both buttons have a low degree of pre and post travel, and to my surprise these buttons do have a snappy rebound to them, which allows the side buttons to be quite spammable. But while the side buttons here are an improvement from the ones on the previous Keris, I do think the buttons themselves should be made larger as they're too small for a mouse of this size, which can make them feel a little odd to use. Ideally, the side buttons should be similar in size to the ones on the Death Adder V4 Pro or Pulsar X-Lite Medium, as that would much better suit the Keris' size and would further improve the side button's performance and usage. And as a last note here, unlike the side buttons on the previous Keris, the ones here are attached to the top shell wall, being anchored in the same way we saw the Viper V3 Pro's side buttons anchored. This means that the side buttons can't be removed from the mouse, but since they have a coating, there's no real reason you want to remove them from the shell unless you want to paint them, that is. For scroll wheel, the Keris uses the same type of wheel we've seen used on every ROG release to date, but the wheel here is in my opinion much better implemented than the wheel used on the previous Keris specifically. Now the wheel itself is the expected type, having the same semi-transparent plastic framing which has a gray flattened rubber texturing wrapped around it, featuring a flash-like texturing etched into its surface. This rubber texturing has been an issue on ROG's older mice as it had a habit of coming loose from the scroll wheel over long-term use, but this issue appears to have been fixed on the ROG II, and I assume it's been fixed here as well, as the texturing is firmly secured to the wheel's framing. And as expected for a ROG product, the wheel does feature lighting via a small node inside it, and this can be configured via the WebDriver, and we'll talk about the mouse's lighting and how to configure it later. Now the wheel itself is positioned fairly traditionally for an ergonomic mouse, but it is a little shallow for my taste, as the wheel has a lower scroll range of 8 points, not the traditional 10 you'll find on more pronounced scroll wheels. While this isn't the biggest issue, I would like to see ROG raise the encoder height a little bit just to make the scroll wheel a little more pronounced. Speaking of the encoder, inside we'll find a rather familiar encoder, specifically a TTC Gold Dustproof 24-step encoder, the 14mm height SKU. This encoder, as expected, seeing as it's been used on almost every mouse this year, has a medium scroll force with semi-pronounced scroll points, which are pronounced just enough to prevent the wheel from slipping when scroll wheel clicking, and it gives the wheel a good balance feel to it. For the scroll wheel click, inside we'll find another familiar component being a taller pillar switch designed with a blue plunger. Sadly, I was unable to ID the manufacturer for this switch, but I assume it's a Kale one as they commonly manufacture these switch types, but it could also be made by TTC or Panasonic. But regardless of the manufacturer, since this is a pillar switch, the actuation weight of the wheel click is on the heavier side, feeling around the 80-gram range, and for travel, the switch has a low degree of both pre and post travel, but as is tradition for a pillar switch, the rebound is weaker than that of a traditional switch type. This gives the wheel click a spongier feel, but as I've said many times here on the channel, this is expected as all pillar switches feel like this, so this isn't an issue per se. For sensor, just like the ROG II Ace, the Keris is using ROG's Aimpoint Pro sensor, which is the same story as every other custom sensor on the market, as it is just a renamed PixArt Paw 950HS. But unlike most mice, the sensor positioning here is quite unique, as on the mouse's x-axis, the sensor sits slightly behind the mouse's 60.5mm physical midline, resting at approximately the 58mm mark, but uniquely on the mouse's y-axis, the sensor rests around 2.6mm off of the mouse's midline. While this is rare, this is not the first time we've seen a unique y-axis sensor position, as Vaxi's implemented a similar concept of the MP01S V2. This unique positioning helps to offset what would be a disjointed feeling, as due to the mouse's large ergonomic shaping, if the sensor was traditionally installed in the center, the way your mouse interacts with the mouse's shell would have a small disjoint between the center of your grip and the sensor's position. But since the sensor is positioned slightly outward on its y-axis, this helps to keep the sensor centered on your grip style. While this is a unique and cool concept, keep in mind that this does introduce a bit of an odd feeling to the mouse out of the box, and it will take some time to acclimate to the sensor's unique positioning, but after a couple days of use you'll get accustomed to this, just as you did the mouse's balancing. Now for sensor specs, as I mentioned a moment ago, this sensor, despite the ROG branding, is just a renamed Pixar PAW 3950HS, specifically a PAW 3950 DMT5QU sensor. But as is tradition for any renamed Pixar SKU, some of its parameters have been adjusted slightly. Starting with DPI, the mouse's sensor supports a DPI range of 100 to 42,000, which is adjustable via 10 DPI steps. The sensor also has an IPS rating of 750 and an acceleration rating of 50. For LOD levels, instead of the traditional 0.71 and 2mm levels we traditionally see on all sensors, here the LOD levels are preset to a low and high value, similar to what we see on Vaxi's 3950 implementation, but unlike Vaxi, ROG isn't advertising the ranges at which these two values track at, which is quite odd. The sensor also supports motion sync and angle snapping, but ripple has been disabled, which is another odd choice given the sensor's max DPI. And unlike the aimpoint sensor we saw in the Keris II Ace, the aimpoint Pro here has been updated to finally support sensor tilting, a feature that was absent on ROG's previous mice. However, while I'm happy to see this feature, just like we saw in the Harpe II Ace, I was rather disappointed to find that the tiltable range was only 20 degrees positively and negatively, not the 33 degrees we find on all 3950s, but the most disappointing aspect here is that the sensor's angle is not freely adjustable as it is on every other 3950 sensor, as for some reason, ROG made it so you have to choose predefined values. This is a very confusing choice, as if users have an odd grip angle such as myself, you can't properly align the mouse's sensor. As such, and as I said when I reviewed the Harpe II Ace, while I'm happy to see sensor tilting supported on a ROG product, they absolutely need to rework their implementation here to allow for the sensor's angle to be set freely and widen the tilt range to the sensor's max. But thankfully, you can override ROG's questionable sensor tilt implementation here by utilizing raw Excel, as with it you can tilt the Keris's or any mouse's sensor however you want, and if you want to learn about what sensor tilting is, how it works, and how it can drastically improve your aim and ergonomics, and as well as learn how to apply it via raw Excel or your mouse's built-in tilt features, check out my guide to sensor tilting, which will be linked in the video description and on screen here. And lastly for MCU, disappointingly, instead of using a Nordic 54 series SoC like the Harpe II did, inside the Keris we'll find a previous generation Nordic NRF 52840 SoC. Sadly, because it's a last gen SoC, this means that the Keris Origins won't have access to the superior performance or runtimes offered by a 54 series SoC. Now they have worked around the power optimizations a little bit here by using a larger battery, but this SoC still lacks the benefits offered by newer versions. In all fairness though, to most users, the difference between the old and new MCUs won't be noticeable, but for an enthusiast like myself, I can't help but be disappointed, and hopefully on all of ROG's future products, we see them continue to use the Nordic 54H20 or 54L15 series MCUs, as they are a significant improvement over the previous generation Nordic SoCs. For connectivity types, just like many of ROG's previous releases, the Keris II Origins is a tri-connectivity mouse, supporting wired USB-C, 2.4 GHz, and Bluetooth connectivity types. Uniquely though, for antenna, instead of using an inboard antenna as we've seen before, ROG opted to use a dedicated antenna design here, something they oddly didn't do in the Harpe II Ace. Now the design of this antenna is eerily similar to the one we saw inside the Viper V3 Pro, but regardless of its similarities, the dedicated antenna is a great attention to detail here, here, as these types of antennas have superior connectivity and interference resistance compared to inboard antennas, and hopefully we'll see ROG continue with this antenna design on their future products. But unlike the mice I just mentioned, all of which support 8 GHz polling, while the Keris does support it, the mouse out of the box is capped to 1 GHz and requires the purchase of a separate polling rate booster to utilize the mouse's higher report rates. This is yet another questionable design decision from ROG here, as the previous version of the Keris included the polling rate booster, while the ROG Keris II Ace didn't need it at all, and I was expecting the mouse to carry over this native dual 8K support, seeing as this is a V2 so to speak from the previous version of the Keris. But sadly that is not the case, meaning I'll have to fork out an additional $45 USD to utilize the mouse's 8K report rates, bringing the mouse's total to an eye-watering 250 Canadian dollars, which is a ludicrous price in my opinion. Thankfully though, I was able to use the polling rate booster I had on hand from my previous Keris to test the mouse's polling rates, but sadly I could not get the mouse to work wired with the booster, as whenever it was connected, the mouse would turn on, but inputs wouldn't register. Initially, I thought this was due to outdated firmware, but the booster is running the latest 2.00.05 version, so it appears as if there is some kind of hardware limitation preventing the older polling rate boosters from working here with the Keris Origins. As such, if you have a polling rate booster from a previous ROG product and plan on using it here with the Keris Origins, keep in mind the USB-C functionality seems to be dependent on the version you have, as the older boosters don't appear to work here for some reason. But despite not being able to utilize the mouse's wired 8K polling, to ROG's credit, the mouse's wireless high polling rate implementations are very well implemented, with no noticeable issues on any of the report rates. Again, I can't say the same thing for the wired ones due to the incompatibility with the polling rate booster, but historically speaking, the wired rates have also been very well implemented, but I'm going off historical data here, and the experience might be different here on the Keris II Origins. For battery, and as mentioned earlier, and just like we saw in the Keris II Ace, the mouse is using a massive 370 mAh battery that uses a standard 2mm JST-PH connector and is installed in the top part of the mouse's central cage-like structure. This is the largest battery I've seen in a mouse since I reviewed the previous Keris, and I initially questioned why they use such a big battery, but then I remembered it's using a last-gen MCU, and as such they've opted to use a bigger battery so the mouse's runtimes would be comparable to mice using the newer Nordic SoCs. For runtimes, ROG is advertising that the mouse's runtime will be approximately 127 hours with the lighting disabled and around 91 with it enabled, but oddly, and just like we saw in the ROG Keris II Ace, they're not giving any estimated runtimes for the 2.4 8K polling, which is a little odd. But regardless of this, my unit says with its max DPI of 42,000, with the lighting enabled and set to max brightness for one test, then disabled for the remainder of my testing, with auto sleep and motion sync disabled and running firmware version 1.00.9, and placed on a mouse jiggler to simulate constant motion. On 1 GHz with the lighting enabled and set to max brightness, the mouse's runtime was approximately 73 hours. On 1 GHz again but with the lighting disabled, the runtime improved to around 95 hours. On 2 GHz, the runtimes as expected dropped down to around 42 hours. On 4 GHz, the runtimes dropped again to around 32 hours, and on 8 GHz, the runtime was the lowest as expected, being around 29 hours. So compared to the runtimes advertised by ROG, the actual runtimes here for the Keris are lower than advertised, which to be honest was expected as we've seen this historically happen on all of ROG's previous releases, but the runtimes here are passable in my opinion, but I do find it very odd that despite using a 370 mAh battery, the mouse's runtimes specifically on 2, 4, and 8 GHz are only slightly better than the runtimes we see on mice using 250 or 300 mAh batteries, which leads me to believe there are some subpar power optimizations done here on a firmware level, as the mouse doesn't appear to be fully utilizing its larger battery. Thankfully, this issue can be addressed via firmware, and hopefully in the future ROG will update the mouse's firmware to better utilize its larger battery. And lastly, for charging, the mouse charges via its front-facing USB-C port, which despite how it looks is fully compatible with almost all types of aftermarket cables, but since the mouse's stock cable is quite good, I doubt you'll need to use aftermarket cables here on the Keris, but if needed you can do so without any compatibility issues. For software, thankfully, unlike the older Keris mice which are only customizable via Armory Crate, the Keris Origins is fully compatible with ROG's new GearLink WebDriver, the same WebDriver I talked about when I reviewed the ROG Keris II Ace, which is rather well implemented, but it is missing a couple key features. Now to access the WebDriver, you'll need to use a Chromium-based browser such as Chrome or Edge, and navigate to the driver's URL, which will be linked down in the video description. Once there, click the Connect button, select your mouse in the drop-down menu, click Connect, and you'll load into the driver. driver. Once loaded in, the driver defaults to the button configuration tab, but before we talk about that, I wanted to highlight some driver specific settings you can configure via the buttons at the top here. Firstly, in the settings menu, you can change the driver's language and choose the driver's display mode. Next, there is a bulletin page which lists release notes and change logs for the WebDriver and the mouse's firmware. Below that, we have an FAQ page which links to ASUS's respective support pages. And lastly, we have a rather unique diagnostic tab which you can use to troubleshoot the mouse, a great feature I wish more brands implemented to ease the troubleshooting experience for customers. Going back to the top right here and clicking the next button, we have a dedicated firmware update page in which you can download updates for both the mouse and driver, but the updates are still manual, not automatic, but regardless, the installation process for any firmware updates is fairly simple. Next, we have a dedicated tab for the mouse's companion mode, which is an installable extension that allows for additional key rebind options here, as the mouse's onboard memory oddly doesn't support macros and Windows shortcuts. As such, if you need these features, you'll need to install the companion app, but thankfully these features are more utility focused and won't be necessary for most gaming use cases. And lastly, there is also a macro button here, but without the companion installed it won't function, as we just talked about. Circling back to the driver's main tab, at the top left here we have a dynamic battery indicator which reflects the mouse's charge or charging level, which is a nice feature, but I would have loved to see an estimated runtime implemented here, as if Vaxi can do it on their WebDriver, ROG absolutely can as well, and hopefully we'll see that added to the driver in the near future. Below this, we can select the mouse's onboard profiles, of which the mouse supports 5, and you can switch between these profiles either via the WebDriver or by pressing the DPI and scroll wheel at the same time. In the next tab, called the button tab, we can adjust the mouse's keybinds, but as we just talked about, the mouse's onboard memory doesn't support macros or keyboard shortcuts, and if you want to utilize them, you'll have to install the aforementioned companion application. But on the plus side, if you do mess up a rebind in this menu, you can reset this tab easily by clicking the reset button at the top right, something you can do in every tab of the software, which is a nice attention to detail. In the next tab, called the performance tab, we can adjust the mouse's DPI levels, either via 4 preset levels or by setting the desired level via the slider below it. You can also disable all but 2 of these levels and assign a color to each level, which will be reflected on the mouse's lighting, but again, there's no option to separate the mouse's X and Y axis DPI, something that should absolutely be implemented on ROG's products. Next in this tab, we can also enable or disable angle snapping, set the mouse's polling rate from 125Hz to 1000Hz or 8000Hz if you use the separate polling rate booster, and lastly for this tab, we can also adjust the sensor's angle, which is a fantastic feature to see here. However, as mentioned earlier, you can only adjust it by 20 degrees positively and negatively, and only to preset values, which is very disappointing, and hopefully in the future, ROG will remove the artificial limitations on this feature in the future. Next, we have a lighting tab, which is pretty self-explanatory, in which you can customize the mouse's lighting effects in the mouse's 3 RGB zones, or you can disable it entirely. Next, we have a calibration tab, in which you can calibrate the mouse to either ROG's mouse pads or manually calibrate it yourself. Now, this supposedly calibrates the mouse's sensor to track more accurately on various surface types. However, just like the other implementations of this feature we've seen from other brands, I generally can't tell if this does anything beneficial, and in both the calibrated and uncalibrated modes, I never experienced any tracking issues here on the Keris, even when I was using it on hard pads. In this tab, we can also select the mouse's LOD levels, but as mentioned earlier, these levels are predefined to low and high, with no indication of what these values actually track at. In the next tab, called power, we can adjust the Keris's power settings, such as at what percentage the mouse enters power saving mode, which you can set to never thankfully, as well as adjust the power saving mode's effects, adjust the mouse's auto sleep timer for 1 to 10 minutes or never, and adjust some other lighting related battery features. And lastly, we have another tab for the mouse's companion mode, but we already talked all about this feature. Now, while the mouse doesn't currently support this feature, I assume we'll see ROG add their zone mode feature we saw in the ROG II Ace to the Keris at some point in the future. Now, this feature is just a fancy name for a sensor comp mode, which locks the sensor's frame rate, the same as the other modes implemented by many other brands. But as is typical for these modes, in reality the performance gains from this is marginal at best and comes at the cost of significantly increased power draw. And as such, and as I say every time I talk about these modes, you'll be better off utilizing the mouse's 2.4 AK polling rates, but seeing as you need a separate polling rate dongle to do that, it's also not the ideal use case here. So if ROG does add this feature in the future, technically there's no real harm in using it if you don't have the polling rate booster, though your battery life will get shredded, but if you do have the polling rate booster that is compatible with the mouse, I'd recommend using the mouse's higher report rates, as they're much more impactful in terms of performance compared to these comp modes. And as a last note, currently GearLink only supports the Keris II Origins and the ROG II Ace, and ROG's previous releases cannot not connect to GearLink, which is disappointing, and hopefully we'll see ROG update their older mice to make them compatible with their rather well implemented WebDriver. For repairability, this is one aspect where the Keris Origins is significantly improved from its predecessor, as I mentioned earlier, as the mouse is very easy to service on a surface level, as you can open the mouse by disconnecting two Phillips head screws from the base here to disconnect the top shell, allowing you to access the mouse's switches and utilize their hot swap feature. But while the mouse is easy to open, you would think this would make the unit very serviceable, but unfortunately, ROG decided to use these odd-looking pentagonal security screws for the rest of the internals, whereas the base screws were standard Phillips heads bits. This is yet another very confusing aspect to the Keris' design, as these screws nullify any serviceability this mouse should have. As while the mouse is easy to open, removing these security bits requires a unique screwdriver bit, which is very disappointing to see. As such, while earlier I compared the mouse's degree of serviceability to endgame gears in regards to swapping the switches, and while it is true for the switches in that isolated use case, any other internal task such as replacing a component, modding, or cleaning is significantly harder to do than it is on endgame gears products, which again is really disappointing to see as the mouse seems to be very serviceable, but in reality it isn't due to the security screws. So while the mouse's more accessible design is an improvement coming from the Keris II Ace, on a future version of the Keris I'd like to see ROG remove these dumbass security screws and just use Phillips heads bits, as if those were the screw types here, the mouse would be as serviceable as endgame gears products, but in its current state the unit is very tricky to service. As such, if you're interested in learning more about the mouse's internal design or how to properly service it, or just want to learn more about the mouse's component weights, get subscribed so you don't miss the Keris II's teardown video, which will be releasing very soon. For stock skates, as mentioned earlier in this video, the Keris includes two types of skates, a pre-installed set of half-size skates and an extra set of full-size skates. Both of these types are 100% PTFE skates and are the exact same type of skates we saw included with the original Keris. These skates are decent skates though, not as good as the thicker layered skates we saw on the ROG II Ace, but they're solid nonetheless, though the full-size skates are a little unbalanced in terms of their surface area. But despite their more traditional nature, these skates perform quite well on soft pad types. However, on hard pad types, due to their 100% PTFE material, they're less than ideal as they wear extremely quickly. So while they perform okay, they're less than ideal for hard pad use, but they'll be perfectly fine for most types of soft pads. But since I used the Keris on hard pads for the majority of my testing, I opted to use the X-Ray Pad U9 Air 8mm dots for the majority of my testing, as they performed much better than the stock ones did on hard pads. But the process of removing the stock skates is kinda tricky, as there are no skate removal ramps in the mouse's base, but on the plus side, the skate channels on the mouse's base are quite thin, just as they were on the ROG II's base, meaning that the mouse is fully compatible with essentially every type of aftermarket skate, which is a great thing to see. But while the stock skates included with the mouse are good here, albeit for soft pad use only, just as I said when I reviewed the ROG II, I wish ROG would include some hard pad optimized skates with the mouse, as currently you'll have to use aftermarket skates if you plan on using the mouse on a hard pad, and if they were to include some proper glass optimized skates out of the box, it'd make the mouse's usage experience much better in my opinion. And lastly, let's talk about the Origin stock cable, which as I talked about earlier in this video is a familiar one, as it's the same fantastic cable we've seen included with ROG's previous releases. For typing, this cable is the expected USB A to C type, but has a rather smooth paracord wrapping, which allows the cable to glide across soft and hard pad surfaces without too much drag or friction. The cable is also quite thin, much thinner than the cables we traditionally see included with other brands' mice, which allows it to be rather flexible and fully compatible with all bungee types. But sadly, the cable's USB-C end isn't tilted, which is something I wanted to see ROG implement when I talked about this cable last time. Regardless though, this stock cable is without a doubt one of the best stock cables I've seen included with a mouse as of late, and given its low friction wrapping and flexible design, makes the Origin's wired experience astronomically better than most competitors' products, even though I wasn't able to utilize the 8K Hz polling. But while the stock cable is great, again I do wish the USB-C end was tilted, and hopefully ROG will implement that on their future cables, as with that small change their cables would essentially be perfect. Alright, in closing, overall the Keris II Origins is a rather confusing release from ROG, as it feels half-baked in so many ways and pales in comparison to the far superior ROG II Ace. And while the mouse does have a great shape and balancing, vastly improved coating over its predecessors, a very well designed hot swap switch socket which is very easy to utilize and has great compatibility, good main click and side click implementations for the most part, good stock skates and decent battery life, and of course the biggest improvement here is that the mouse is compatible with ROG's ROG's GearLink WebDriver, which makes the mouse infinitely more usable and customizable than the previous versions, which were only configurable via Armory Crate. But while there are some silver linings here, so to speak, the mouse is much heavier than its predecessor due to the added RGB and other internal components. The main clicks are too thin, which makes them feel flimsy and cheap, specifically at their end region. On top of that, for reasons that are beyond me, ROG didn't apply the shell's fantastic coating to the main clicks, which significantly hinders their usage experience, and you'll be reliant on grip aids, either the included ones or aftermarket ones, to consistently utilize them. On top of the lack of coating, the main click's travel ranges are also very long and should be tightened up, and there's no way to adjust the debounce value on the main clicks, even if you use other switch types, which is very disappointing. And the side buttons, while they do have a coating applied to them, are too small and the gapping between them is too thin. The scroll wheel is slightly too shallow, which impacts its scroll range, and again, for some reason, ROG hasn't properly secured the sensor's lens, and the sensor tilting implementation is very poor, and I would highly recommend using ROG Cell to tilt the mouse's sensor until ROG fixes their implementation. The mouse also uses a last generation Nordic MCU, which while implemented, pales in comparison to the performance offered by the Nordic 54 series SoCs we saw used in the ROG Keris II Ace, and the mouse, despite how it looks and how it's advertised, is much less serviceable than it appears to be due to the usage of security screws. The mouse's base doesn't have any skate removal ramps, and the mouse doesn't include any hard pad optimized skates. Which brings me to the two biggest issues I have with the Keris Origins, as the mouse's pricing is very high and well outside the expected range for a product like this, and my other biggest gripe is that ROG has locked the mouse's dual AK polling to a separate purchase, which is very, very disappointing compared to both the ROG Keris II with its native AK and the Keris II Ace, which included the polling dongle. And as I mentioned earlier, even with the dongle I had on hand, I was unable to test the mouse's wire connectivity, as whenever I plugged in the booster, the mouse would not operate on its wire connection. But to be fair to ROG, obviously this mouse is aimed more at the consumer market, not the pro and enthusiast market, but regardless of this, the improvements here in the Origins doesn't merit the price increase and doesn't separate itself enough from the Keris II Ace in my opinion, which makes this mouse feel kinda pointless, and one that is easily outclassed by the ergonomic mice offered by other brands, even though they lack several of the Keris II Origins features. But all that said, I still think there is hope for the Keris series, as the shape is genuinely really good, and I would love to see ROG make a Keris 3, but designed with the same philosophy that we saw in the ROG Keris II Ace, as a Keris with that mouse's features and performance, while keeping the same hot swap switches and improved serviceability, would be a Keris I'd absolutely love to see, as it would likely be a fantastic mouse, but the current iteration is anything but a fantastic mouse, and it is not a mouse I'd recommend purchasing, as there are just way better ergonomic options available from other brands. But with that, that's everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you very much for watching, and big thanks again to ROG for sending over the Keris II Origins for review. If you would like to support my efforts on the channel with these in-depth reviews and the Teardown project, please consider becoming a channel member here on YouTube, as that is the best way to directly support what I do here on the channel, and being a channel member also gives you early access to all upcoming content. So if you enjoy what I do and want to see new episodes before anyone else, consider becoming a channel member today. Thanks again for watching my review of the ROG Keris II Origins, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.